Hello and welcome to this video on how we can make the dream of all otakus and weebs possible, catgirls. Or for that matter, we could even try other beastkin if possible. We mean actual catgirls in this case, and not furries. We don't want to see furries. For this, let's assume a typical catgirl, that is, cat ears, a tail, feline behaviors, but an otherwise human body, and relatively comparable human features and cognitive ability. There are two ways we could get here without having to do too much. The first is convergent evolution from two different species. That is, a feline species begins to develop more and more human traits, or conversely, humans begin to develop feline traits. The other is evolution of catgirls alone as their own species. For whatever reason, this may happen. Honestly, though, neither option is particularly good. They rely on nature to evolve the necessary traits and features, but nature is capricious and arbitrary in some ways. Just look at the platypus. Further to that, it would take an incredibly long time, and nobody has time for that. No, we want catgirls, and we want them now, so let's make them ourselves. That will mean getting Neko-chan without any weird randomness. To get catgirls, we'll need to figure out how to cause the right ears to happen, a tail, possibly feline behaviors, and there may be issues of reproduction amongst other things. Let's try and keep this simple and approach the problem as a modification of the human body. Think of people who are absolutely dedicated to body modification, and it's along the same lines. More extreme, but the same idea. First of all, let's look to genetic modification of the human genome to create cat ears. Without cat ears, there's almost no point, or is that points, to this. First, we'll work on the premise of only creating a catgirl with cat ears and not human ears. To some extent, this will remove the need for increased brain capacity for two sets of ears. We'll need to allow for the slight increase in muscles related to the movement of the ears. This means some changes to the head. Mostly it will involve a slight increase in the muscles, or perhaps more accurately to say the number and mass of muscles, as they will pull on the ears to move them in response to stimuli. In cats, this is a muscle that travels down and along the jaw, and to a certain extent down and along the back of the head. In catgirls, this wouldn't necessarily work, since it would lead to a major increase in jaw size. Instead, a smaller muscle and more towards the back and bottom of the skull, along with a longer, flat and wider tendon to the cartilaginous tissue at the base of the upright ear. If the ear is to move to a varying degree, such as being slightly perky, very perky, or not raised at all, then the tendon would need to go from the base of the ear all the way to the middle of the ear. This would not only increase the degree of movement available as the muscle can more finely move and interact with the ear itself. We'll also need a slight change to the ear canal. That is how sound goes from the outer ear to the inner ear and then the brain. Normally the human brain links to the ears from the brain stem. The outer ears, that is the ear you'd be familiar seeing on the outside of the head, and then the inner ear canal eventually finds its way to the neurons that interact with it. This is where the eardrum is, and they sense the vibrations from this. This then goes to the brainstem, and that then communicates the, results of sound to the brain. This works well enough for the human body, but the issue here is that it only works because the ears are low enough on the head for this connection to be possible. For catgirls with ears on top of their head, it will either need to rely on a cranial nerve to connect the brain, or it could be possible to have the nerve run along the tendon and muscle into the brain stem itself. The best case scenario would, however, be that the ear canal enters into the inner ear, and the nerves connected to this go through the skull and straight to the brain from there. This is, however, a more risky development, as it could open up all sorts of issues. This would also support why catgirls are much more sensitive to being touched here, as the stimulus is immediate and direct. It would also create a slight weakness in the skull, meaning cranial injuries are going to be more significant. And now that we have the gross anatomical changes sorted, let's see how we get, here in the first place. At least in real examples we see today, many of the traits we may be looking for are going to be recessive, so this is something we need to address. In genetics terminology, the recessive genes are something that will only be expressed when there are two copies, or one copy from each parent, present in the individual. If this is not the case, for example, one parent has the gene and the other does not, we will not see the catgirls with cat-like ears, or any traits for that matter. This means that we either have to do one of two things to deal with this. One is the trait needs to be dominant, which means we only need one copy for it to work, or we'd have to be very selective in breeding of catgirls, which does raise some ethics issues. In terms of the genes themselves, we are going to need certain genes to be present, and others will need to be removed. For perky catgirl ears, we need to make changes on the 11th chromosome. That is if dog ear genetics can be at least somewhat translated to our idealistic catgirl. For this change, we need certain gene sequences to be modified in the MSRB3 and HMGA2 genes. The particular change can be seen here. This will lead to ears that perk up and stand up. This gets ears to grow as not only somewhat larger ears, but ears that, at least in practice, should be more cat-like. We also need to modify the TRPV4 gene. This would not only ensure that the catgirl ears stand upright, but the cartilaginous growth is correct. If this is not the normal kind, we're going to have a slight problem, and depending on your tastes, this may or may not be desirable. That is, if the gene in question has any mutations, or particular mutations, to be specific, it may cause a misfold in some of the proteins involved and mean that the ears do not stand upright, but rather fold over. The good news is that this gene under normal circumstances leads to the expected catgirl ears. In terms of the inside of the ear, it's fortunate that further into the ear canal we don't actually need to make too many changes, if any at all, as it's relatively homologous between cats as an animal and humans, meaning catgirls shouldn't be any different. The final element is going to be fetal development. That is during gestation, how the fetal cells start to proliferate and differentiate. Now, following this is the migration or apoptosis of cells that should not be where they are, or, more importantly, should go where they need to be. If you do not have this, then the ears, and for that matter other features such as the catgirl's tail, simply won't grow. Or you're going to find that they start growing in places that you certainly don't want to see them. This is why, for instance, you may find that certain tissues in humans, such as with endometriosis, start growing in places they're not meant to be. That's exactly this sort of problem, although somewhat different, but the outcomes are relatively similar in the issues they present. Next is the catgirl's tail. This is the other major element we need to achieve for catgirls, as without the tail and ears, we may as well not try. Arguably, the tail itself is somewhat easier, as humans can already grow a very short tail, although it's generally seen as a pathology rather than desirable, but with catgirls, it is wanted. Thankfully, the caudal muscles can grow longer and the vertebral nerves and spinal cord can all function perfectly well in this scenario. This means the tail as a basic structure should not be a problem. These muscles and nerves can move the tail and cause it to twitch, sway, and so on, whether intentionally or unintentionally. The challenge for humans to create catgirls is that even if we were to develop one as using a human as the basic model, the tail is going to be short. This is just not good enough for our catgirl dreams. Studies using mouse models have found that the Hox genes are going to be one of the things we need to focus on, as they will determine the tail length in mammals, and this is our first consideration. And next is that we can look to actual cats and the various genes that are involved in deciding the length of their tail, as there are certain breeds of cat that have been selected for to have either no tail at all or very short tails. This research has allowed us to track down not only which chromosomes to focus on, but what parts, understand very large parts of the chromosome, but nonetheless what parts to focus on. One of the things we should look at is the HES7 gene, which does have a causal relationship resulting in a missense mutation, and when that happens, the tail is shortened. when it's the normal gene, that is the wild type or the type without a mutation, the tail should be longer. If we ensure that the catgirls have this normal, otherwise properly functioning gene, it should give us a longer catgirl tail. Conversely, if you were after shorter tails, you would need to have this mutation or something similar. There are also some other examples that may be useful depending on the interactions with the targeted gene, that being the HES7, and other species. For example, Manx cats that are known to have a short tail have a T-box gene mutation, and this is why they have short tails. So if we are looking at interactions with other genes, this is something to focus on. To get pointed cat ears, which are another thing we should speak of briefly, we need to look at the protein sequences, and that's a lot of what these mutations are going to be focusing on. For pointed ears, we should look at the tyrosinase gene, and this is known to be present in certain breeds. And because of this, mutations in that can cause similar issues. And strangely enough, there does appear to be some relationship between the positions of various amino acids within this and the expression of it in certain species. Strangely enough, there is actually similarities between this gene in cats and in humans. There's also a case to be made for fur, or possibly hair depending on how we look at this. The depiction of catgirls often separates the fur and hair to some degree. That is, the ears and tail are clearly covered in fur, while the head has actual hair much like a human. To get different colours of catgirl hair, or fur, we'd need the following changes in genetics. To get brown fur, we'd need the TYRP1 enzyme to be slightly modified, as this is what's responsible for producing eumelanin. And then we need to look at parts of the dominant versus recessive genes again here. If we have the varying types of recessive versions, you get a chocolate coloured and a cinnamon coloured fur colour. Then we have orange coloration, which is going to be a result of phenylalanine replacing the eumelanin content. This is related to the X chromosome, and so we're going to have to look at the kind of gene expression based on that. Interestingly enough, females would be orange, whereas males, based on the presence of the X chromosome issue, would be orange or non-orange depending on exactly how well or what genes are being expressed. The tabby or tortoiseshell type colours are generated by the agouti gene, and this is important as it is on the first chromosome, and so if we don't have this present, we're not going to see it expressed. But interestingly, it is dominant, so that does help us somewhat. There are also varying kinds of the gene being expressed, and so we need to be more careful in either maintaining certain lineages to ensure its presence or otherwise. There's also other, along the same lines, issues to do with the kind of genes being expressed. For example, the tabby coloration can be co-expressed with orange fur, leading to splotchy type coloration in places and tortoiseshell coloring in others. In order to get a coloration more akin to, say, a snow leopard, we need to look at the KIT gene. And that's because it's going to result in the base coat being white, and generally speaking a solid white. Not quite albinism, but getting towards that direction. In order to get a silver coloration added to this, we'd need the melanin inhibitor gene to be present with a dominant and recessive version. If the genetics do not allow for that trait to be there with the melanin inhibitor, the coloration of the cat becomes golden rather than being silver, and this is down to the corin gene. In terms of the length of the catgirl hair, or fur more accurately, we need to look at dominant versus recessive genes again. The short and oversimplified version is that if we have the fibroblast growth factor 5 present, it is going to result in short hair. If the recessive version is present, it's going to result for long hair. This also then leads to issues around if you have two different parents, one with the recessive and one with the dominant gene, you may or may not get the desired results. As far as the fur goes, there are a wide range of genes responsible for the different forms. For example, fur that is curly. This involves a whole load of different mutations, and you can see a relatively straightforward summary of them here. Then we have the case of hairlessness, although that does seem like a rather bizarre choice, and again you can see the considerations here. And then finally, we have the unusual fur mutations. Some of these are more useful than others, depending on what's happening. Beyond the tail, ears, and arguably fur, we should consider the behavior of a catgirl. The obvious examples will be ending every sentence in nya. The behaviors we need to consider are perhaps somewhat more obscure, but depending on what kind of catgirl they are, we must consider this, especially if they're going to get into heat. That is the reproductive cycle. Starting with the simple fact that there is evidence of heritability of genes, and these will drive behaviors among the catgirls. And weirdly enough, unlike most other, let's say, human studies, there is a relatively high correlation between genetic traits and behaviors. Think of cats being rather shy, let's say, or that they can be very aggressive. All of these are considerations if we're looking at catgirls. After all, they are going to be, if not, at least very close to an adult human size, and as a result they can cause rather significant damage if they are going to be aggressive. Studies so far have found that there is relationships between shyness towards strangers, aggression, there is activity levels, willingness to contact people, and the, well, to be quite blunt about this, playfulness. Let's call it that anyway. There's also some evidence of relationships between sociability, exploration, and how frisky they get. And this does lead us to the reproductive cycle and problem. Partly because it is a cyclical thing, and partly because cats and arguably catgirls could produce litters of kittens. The cats go through at least a somewhat predictive cycle. It's in some ways similar to humans. Unlike humans that operate on a 28-day cycle, cats operate on a 14 to 21-day cycle. It has 4 stages, and one is a relatively brief stage called proestrus, and this is where the female cat is attractive to males but not fertile, or willing to mate for that matter. Estrus is when the female is ready and receptive to males and can become impregnated, and this lasts for anywhere between 3 and 14 days. And then we have interestrus or diestrus, and this is the period in between that, and that's going to last for up to 2 to 3 weeks each time. And finally there is the anestrus stage, and this is when reproduction is dormant and normally occurs during cold periods. In effect, cats will be seasonal reproducers. As a result, during colder months and shorter days, cats don't go into heat and as a result can't reproduce. The key thing here is that a female catgirl, if they were like a regular cat, would undergo multiple periods of heat each year, and this involves a drastic change in behavior. The other concern here, though, is that, well, multiple periods of such violent hormonal changes could be bad for something the size of a human, not to mention the behavioral changes that go with it. There is also the relatively blunt point to be made that if we have catgirls, we might well have catboys, and, well, having them behave like even more aggressive and horny teenagers is probably not a great idea. And this then leads to the problem of what happens if reproduction does occur. If they're more like cats in this way, they can reproduce in a litter, and the issue is, well, successful births. The anatomy, if they are human-shaped and sized, is not well suited to either carrying the catgirl kittens to term or delivering them. That is if catgirls reproduce like cats and not humans. If they're more like humans, then the issue is one of both the fertility cycle, duration of gestation, and size of the fetus before birth. This is how we can get catgirls, or at least something damn close. It is the way to catgirls and arguably the problems of being a catgirl. We did not opt for certain traits, such as claws, since this runs contrary to the idea of an idolized catgirl. Further, it's not as relevant to other animals, or human, or even anthropomorphic creatures. Of course, while our video does focus on catgirls, it is entirely possible that similar approaches could be taken to make dog girls, fox girls, and so on. You can basically create any other beast people you want using the same basic concept, but we've begun with the more, let's call them desirable catgirl. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.